Hello, Culver City. My name is Freddy and I'm running for Culver City Council. There's so much at stake in this upcoming election, and voters need to have the most up-to-date information so they can make the best decision. And that's why I've launched the Conversations with Freddy series. Each episode will feature a different thought leader and explore a variety of topics. And through conversation, my goal is to raise awareness of the critical issues that Culver City is facing and the solutions we need to move forward. Our guest today is Dr. Eric Strauss. Eric is the LMU President's Professor of Biology and the Executive Director of the Center for Urban Resilience at LMU. He also leads the Culver City Coyote Study and Management Program. He received his BS in Mass Communication from Emerson College and a PhD in Biology from Tufts University. Eric is also the editor-in-chief of Influential Cities and the Environmental Journal. Welcome, Eric. Good to see you today.
Thank you. It's a delight to be with you.
Likewise. And today we'll be discussing housing and sustainability. And housing is a hot issue in the state and in Culver City. So let's dive into it, shall we?
That sounds great. And I just will start by reminding you and mentioning to folks that my history is I have, for most of my life, been a New Englander. And I had this opportunity 12 years ago to come out to Los Angeles and accept this position at LMU. And I'm reminded that in the LA metro area, you have more people than all of New England and Long Island put together in a relatively small area. So when we're talking about sustainability and housing and these issues, there's not a more important area in the United States to be having this conversation than in Los Angeles.
Agreed. And we need to really take these issues seriously. And for instance, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change says that we can help mitigate the negative effects of climate change if we redesign and rezone our cities, which includes building more housing close to where people work and play. Do you agree with this conclusion? And what does the science and research say about all this?
Well, the science can be very complicated, but some of the physics and reality, the physical reality is relatively simple. The more space people have between where they work and where they live means that they're going to have to invest energy to get back and forth. And when you reduce that distance, you reduce the amount of energy that's consumed, which in this country and still around the world is mostly fossil fuels. So the economic engine of these urban communities, and remember, more than half the world's population now live in cities. In the United States, that's approaching 70%. And so we really do have to get cities right because it's the vast majority of where people live and where these economic engines are really revved up. But I do like to say, in reality, we're all urban dwellers, even if you're in remote rural locations, because usually you're doing agriculture or some other resource acquisition that's going to fuel these cities. So yes, we have to find solutions for denser housing in order to reduce fossil fuels and reduce the distance you have to move people in order to get them between their places where they live and places where they work.
Are there any other viable options to achieving our housing and sustainability goals, or are there any negative potential impacts to the environment from more of this urban infill?
Well, sure, as you begin to get to this 6, 7, 8, 9,000 people per square mile or even higher, you have some what they call scaling effects. And it's kind of interesting because the amount of energy it requires to run these systems as they get more dense actually goes down and so forth. But on the flip side of that, the conflicts and tensions affiliated with the human dynamic also go up. And so we need to find solutions for that. It typically involves creating more green space, more place for recreation. Our dwelling units get a little bit smaller. And of course, if they share walls like in a condominium or apartment complex, then they use less materials to be built. So the successful urban ecosystems require all of this awareness in order to get them right. You can't just solve one aspect of the problem. You're trying to get clean water, clean air, reduced energy. That's all great. But you also need to move towards social equity and human well-being so that the experience is such that people want to contribute and commit to this kind of living.
So interesting. And you mentioned, the region that we're in with so many people. What's going to happen if we don't do anything in regards to, sustainability and changing the way we think about housing?
Well, what happens is we continue this ramping up of the amount of energy and resources that are required in order to move a greater percentage of people into the middle class and into the kind of lifestyles that we've created the expectation for. And so we're already in the middle of a water crisis in California, being driven to some degree by drought, but also being driven by population expansion. And so, we're seeing increased heat island effects, all of the kind of things that impact our well-being. And so the challenge for us is to find solutions and use the incredible wealth that we have as a nation. And all the developed nations have this wealth capacity, because other cities have done this that have even less resources than we do, to find these kind of livable solutions in preparation for a planet with 10 billion people. If we have about 7 billion people now, the prediction is that within the next century we'll hit 10 billion. But kind of the good news is we'll, at current reproductive rates and things, we're going to kind of level off there and not hit the 14 or 17 billion people that we were really concerned about, really panicked about in the 1980s when I was in graduate school and we're using those population models. But through the empowerment of women and increased global education, we've seen population and the increased resources necessary to support healthy communities, we've seen overall growth rates in human population slow down.
I want to go back to something you mentioned earlier about green space. I often hear that things like upzoning or increasing, housing will cause a loss of trees. Is this true? And is it possible for our housing goals to coexist with keeping and increasing our tree canopy and other green space?
Well, that's a great question. And our lab has been working a lot on tree canopy analysis. We led a team of people about 3 or 4 years ago where we mapped in very high resolution the tree canopy cover for Los Angeles County, and we're now moving into other arenas to do this work. And, LA has on average about 20% tree canopy, but it varies dramatically depending on the neighborhood. But what's amazing is that in typical American cities, about 70% of the space is still set aside for vehicle parking and travel and things like that. So we need to begin to think differently about these spaces. And therefore, when we do, as we increase densification of buildings and begin to rely a little less on one-person operated automobiles, we create the space to make sure that canopy can be maintained. And remember, all of these structures, the gray infrastructure, are surfaces upon which green infrastructure can be built. The key aspect with trees and canopies, this whole notion of photosynthesis, right? We're taking in carbon dioxide and spewing out oxygen, and the shade and the additional water capacity of trees and other green infrastructure lowers temperatures, all these multitasking events that trees and green infrastructure do for us. So it involves thinking differently about what the solutions look like as you increase density. It does not mean that you have to reduce your green infrastructure. Green infrastructure can accelerate. It just looks a little bit different.
Yeah, you talked about mobility and parking spaces, and Culver City Council recently voted to eliminate parking minimums. But Southern California is such a car-dependent culture. And the more we get people out of their cars and into alternative modes of transportation, the more it will decrease traffic and congestion, and also decrease greenhouse gas emission. Are there any examples of cities where habits and patterns have changed, perhaps in response to overcrowding, gridlock, or dangerous levels of pollution?
Well, when we look for solutions, often we look towards Europe, where cities are really old. You think about a city like Venice that's 1,500 years old and was designed at a time when everybody walked to work and walked back and so forth. And so some of those cities, Heidelberg and Venice and Barcelona being in 2014 with this massive mobility plan, has given us models that we can apply to the United States. And across the United States, most of our biggest cities, west of the Mississippi, came about and really grew into fruition when the automobile was already an emergent and important component of our culture. And so it's been built with the kind of space for automobiles. But that space can be reimagined for other kinds of mobility, such as bicycles and scooters and hydrogen powered buses and things like that. And so places like Los Angeles and San Francisco and Buffalo and New York City, I made those choices because some of them are warm year round, some of them are have real winters and so forth. They're all working on projects. San Francisco in their Market Street area is a $600 million project to reimagine mobility. And with the technology that we have, we can have these alternative forms of mobility, but still have some forms of traditional vehicle access in critical areas so that people who have mobility issues or carrying materials and things like that can still get in. If we think about some of these cities, they're creating what they call these superblocks. That Barcelona, for instance, where these big areas where cars are allowed on the periphery, but then there's sort of alternative mobility inside those super blocks, but yet you can still bring automobiles in at a very reduced speed, like 10 or 15 miles an hour, for people who need mobility access. These are real possible solutions. And look, the future of the automobile, it may take many forms. And in the rural areas of the United States, it will still be, and the world, it will still be the primary mode of transportation. And so there's a hybrid, no pun intended, relationship between how mobility will take shape moving forward into the future.
Yeah, also it meets our sustainability goals, but it's also a safety thing. As we're in this, as we decrease the speed limits, it's going to be better for pedestrian and or car accidents, collisions.
And better for ourselves to be doing more walking and more cardiovascular activity and those kinds of things that once you free yourself from constant dependence on the automobile can actually take the role of how it was imagined, this incredible opportunity to travel larger distance or to go to specific areas in much the same way you see horses being used now. There are people who love horses and they're passionate about them and they ride them for recreation and weekends. We don't routinely see people riding horses downtown urban areas. Maybe in Burbank, but there's still lots of horses. But it's changing. It's not requiring that the culture be removed. It's changing the way in which we access the cultural advantages of automobile mobility.
Right. Thank you. The governor's called for the creation of millions of new housing units while demanding that people cut back on water usage. We know that there's been a decades-long trend of diminishing water use per capita, but does a place like Southern California have enough water to accommodate the growing population and all this housing that we want to build?
Well, and there's an obvious answer to that under the current mode or the current modality of water delivery and water use, the answer to that is no. But when we take what we've learned from places like Israel and Australia and other Mediterranean climates that have similar water challenges and also go through periods of drought, there are all kinds of solutions that can be applied. As you've pointed out, Angelenos and Southern Californians in general use less water per person, per capita, as you say, than most other people in the United States. That's already a good news. And we have changed some of the water use devices in our homes, like our shower heads and toilets and things like that. But there's so much more that can be done. In the agricultural arena, there is more dense growing systems using drip irrigation and things like that. In our own uses, there's still ways in which we could be much better with our water and with the recycling of water and the use of water in different stages of water quality. Right now, when you turn on the tap anywhere in LA, the water has to be pure enough for you to drink. But most of the water we use doesn't have to be that clean. It really doesn't. And so we could have these different scales of water cleanliness so that they can be used in their appropriate fashion. But so yes, the long answer is with the implementation of appropriate technology, we can invite additional housing, densification, and so forth, because the good news is it revs up the economy. It makes us more of a center for generating knowledge and materials and things like that.
Aside from housing and mobility, are there any other things that the scientific community is recommending to make cities more sustainable and neighborhoods more healthy?
Yes, indeed. And the interface here that's so interesting, if you work in the field that I do of urban ecology, is this recognition, first of all, that cities are not the problem, cities are the solution. And second, that it's a fully integrated system of wellness that we need to embrace, just in the same way that the medical field and the veterinary field and so forth is embracing something called the One Health Initiative. So we train people more holistically and collectively around these various subfields. The same is true in urban ecology. So one of the critical indicators of whether communities are successful or not is whether people love where they live. And so loving where you live involves certainly the traditional environmental issues that the protections around water and air and soil and so forth, the traditional arenas of environmental science, but also the issues of social equity and community wellness and tolerance and the acceptance of diversity and the recognition of the tremendous economic power of diversity. Those elements working together in a transdisciplinary approach are, I think, the pathways into the most successful, sustainable communities going forward. And to some degree, you and I both have long histories at universities. We tend to divide our disciplines up, and we have colleges of science and colleges of humanities and colleges of arts and different departments. These are all shared arenas of knowledge that our students and our stakeholders need to recognize are completely integrated into a healthy life.
I just definitely see a lot more of that crossover within the different disciplines, which is so exciting. And that's where a lot of this change is going to happen. I want to shift gears a little. Part of the work that you do at the LMU Center for Urban Resilience focuses on restorative justice practices for schools and municipalities. It's a relatively new concept. Not everyone knows what restorative justice is. Would you mind just describing it or how you use it, and then share how cities in particular are implementing restorative justice practices?
Sure, I'd be delighted. Our Center for Urban Resilience is entering its 11th year at LMU, and around its third year, we were invited by, at that time, the dean of the law school and Joe Hellige, who was the provost at the university at the time, to see if our center would be interested in embracing the restorative justice program, which got its start, not surprisingly, at the law school, where many of these programs start. And we saw this as an incredible way to integrate the science of urban ecology into the well-being and the social fabric of communities. So restorative justice is a series of principles and actions that originally come out of the Maori people in New Zealand. And as you know, there's a tremendous tragedy that happens in developed nations and United States especially, where we have so many people who are incarcerated, most of them for nonviolent crimes and things like that. And it's a recognition that we actually have the capacity that we can take 1.5 million people and simply, most of them relatively young men who are at the prime of their physical productivity, put them away somewhere and our society doesn't collapse. It's still a tragedy, but the society keeps plugging away. In other Aboriginal communities, they can't afford to do that with people. And so the Maori people of New Zealand developed this justice system where people who committed harm to other people were held accountable, but were not forced out of the community. And in fact, that accountability went throughout their lifetime. And so coming out of that was a model for modern communities to think about the traditional transition from an idea of what crime was committed and what punishment fits that crime to something that who was harmed and how is that harm repaired. And so its most normal applications recently have been in school districts, where there's a tremendous problem. In fact, it's got a nickname called the school to prison pipeline, where young teenagers, often young males in underserved communities, get in trouble with the law early on, typically in a school setting, and the tracking onto prison is almost locked in. So restorative justice programs got their start in schools. And in areas where they have been used, they have reduced expulsion and suspension by something like 70 to 90% in some of the communities. That's been our experience here in Los Angeles. But the transgressions that have happened, people are held accountable. And the community together helps decide how that harm can be ameliorated. And both the person who's harmed and the person who did the harm have to agree to go through it. If they don't, then there's always the traditional judicial system to be used. And it's phenomenally successful. In my opinion, it's been a little bit corrupted, as people are applying the restorative justice moniker to all kinds of things that aren't truly restorative justice activities. And so sometimes the success can be modulated that way. But the really exciting part has been that the way that restorative justice works, the practices themselves are being applied into conflict situations in industry, at universities, in corporations, as a way of holding each other accountable for each other's well-being. And so part of I would say more than half the work we're doing right now at the Center for Urban Resilience are contracts and programs to do work at other universities, our own university, LMU, and also in the corporate setting to try and help ameliorate harm that's been done either intentionally or unintentionally, and to make these communities more productive and more harmonious. So I would encourage people to go to our website at LMU, Center for Urban Resilience, and look up restorative justice. It's fascinating. It's sort of a new way of doing business around the issue of harm and amelioration. It's very, very exciting.
I just love it because it really places the value on the individual. Everyone is important while holding people accountable, even more accountable. So I really
That's right.
That. Just want to wrap it up with talking a little bit about the Culver City Coyote Management Program. I know that the program was significantly impacted by COVID-19, but can you share some of the most compelling findings from conducting the program?
Sure. And I will say that we're very proud of the fact that even through the worst part of COVID-19, this was considered a public health issue. And so our teams never stopped collecting data. In fact, our 30 remote camera systems have gathered over 2.5 million images over the past 3 years of the study. Our social surveys were conducted. What we had to do is make sure that during the worst of it, no more than one person was ever in our lab at the same time. No more than one person was working at a field site at a time. So that meant that often many of the students couldn't be working in the field. They could be analyzing data, but we don't like to send students in the field with less than 2 people. But the postdoc, Dr. Melinda Weaver, and other staff members could work alone in the field. So we never stopped collecting data, radiotelemetry data, molecular data, dietary data, and so forth. So that part's pretty cool. And there's been lots of coyote studies done nationally now. So we're getting a really good picture about the variation in behavior with coyotes in urban areas. But we're also beginning to understand that the risk is for the most part predictable. It's linked to microclimate. It's linked to ecological conditions. We know that much of the conflict with humans and coyotes come from coyotes' sort of voracious need for resources, mostly in the form of food. And so during periods of drought, when the rabbit population and other small mammal populations are declining, the risk to our domestic pets, primarily cats, goes up. And so we can be aware of that. We also know that there's significant differences in the risk that people face with coyotes based on the individual social groups. So we have at least 2 social groups. Some people would call them packs, but that's a very kind of specific term, and we don't use that term in the science of coyotes. We do in wolves, but not in coyotes. But the social groups, one group, the Mary Crest Manor group, actually spent very little time in areas where cats were being taken. We think it's more likely a social group that's coming off of the Ballona Creek. It's also different individuals at different times in their lives, dispersing males as they leave their natal communities are the ones people see downtown most often. And they're the ones, they don't know where they're going. They've never been where they're just trying to go somewhere where they don't detect other male coyotes. And those are ones that can be pretty troublesome. So different social groups are at very different levels of risk. We also know that under certain circumstances, you're going to have to remove coyotes that have demonstrated that they are at high risk to humans. That needs to be very carefully considered because it's too often the wrong coyotes are taken out. And whenever you take coyotes out of a population, the territory breaks down and local densities of coyotes actually go up. So when you're removing coyotes, you need to remember you're trading them for a player to be named later, if you will. And you want to make sure that you're not taking out the wrong coyotes. So what do people need to do? They need to reduce the resources that coyotes find important anywhere in their yard. That's water, food, fruits, all these kind of things that coyotes can use. So they need to manage these resources, and we have tools to help them do that. We have backyard safety surveys and so forth. And also, Culver City began, but we need to establish a much better network of formal and informal information so that people can learn about hazing. They can learn more about their resource management of pet foods and so forth, and the fluctuation of seasonal risks. Coyotes populations are here. We're not going to remove coyotes, and managed properly, they actually reduce some of the zoonotic disease risk to animals, to humans, because they act as top order predators. Top order predators, well, they're mesopredators, but we're not going to tolerate the actual top order predators like bears and mountain lions walking down the middle of Culver City. So it's the middle predators that we're left with, the raccoons and coyotes and so forth. And they actually have positive ecosystem services if we manage them correctly.
Amazing. Well, Eric, thank you so much for your time today and for all the knowledge that you shared with us. I really benefited on this and I really appreciate it. And just want to say thank you to everyone who tuned in today. Our next conversations with Freddy will be on Sunday, August 28th. We'll be discussing mobility with Adrian Hoff from Streets for All. So thank you so much and hope you have a good rest of the weekend. Thanks, Eric.
Thank you.